Hey friends, tonight let's take a walk through the crooked back alleys of history. Not the polished tales of marble statues and heroic portraits, but the odd detours that no one could have invented. Between wars, inventions, and empires lie the peculiar moments that prove humans have always been a little ridiculous. When armies lost to animals, emperors fought the sea, or rivers stank so badly they shut down governments. So as you settle into your pillow, I'll share 25 of the strangest true events ever recorded. Tales gently retold for sleep, equal parts funny and fascinating. Before we begin, if you truly enjoy these stories, hitting like or subscribe helps me keep making them, and hopefully helps you keep drifting off. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. I'm always amazed by the places people tune in. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath in, and let it out. Let's begin not with kings or castles, but with a war so strange it hardly seems real. A war fought not against nations, but against birds. The Emu War, 1932, Australia. The year was 1932, and Australia was already carrying heavy burdens. The Great Depression had rolled across the world, and for farmers in Western Australia, life was an exhausting test. They had been promised government support if they expanded their wheat fields, and so, through sweat and perseverance, they planted crops across the dry earth. But the government's promises of subsidies were slow to arrive. Wheat prices were plummeting, and as if that wasn't enough, a new enemy soon marched onto the scene. Not a rival nation, not a plague of locusts, but birds, specifically emus. If you've never seen an emu, picture something almost prehistoric. Standing 6 feet tall, weighing over 100 pounds, they are like feathered dinosaurs that forgot how to fly. With long legs built for sprinting and claws sharp enough to slice through wire, emus were no harmless poultry. And in late 1932, some 20,000 of them migrated from the inland toward the coast, straight into the newly planted wheat fields. For the hungry birds, it was paradise. For the desperate farmers, it was disaster. Imagine looking out over your struggling field, only to see a horde of giant birds devouring your livelihood, trampling the stalks and multiplying daily. The farmers pleaded with the government for help, and in one of the most unusual responses in history, the government agreed to send in the army. Yes, the army, with soldiers, with trucks, with machine guns. The mission was simple: rid the countryside of emus. The press would later dub it the Great Emu War, and though no official declaration of war was made, the name stuck, because that's exactly how it felt. At first, the soldiers must have thought it would be easy. How hard could it be to shoot big, flightless birds? But the emus had no interest in standing still like practice targets. The moment the guns opened fire, the birds scattered in every direction. They ran with astonishing speed, up to 30 miles per hour, and in a zigzagging pattern that made them nearly impossible to hit. Whole groups of them would vanish into the bush before a soldier could reload. The first operation was a fiasco. 2,000 rounds of ammunition were fired. Only a handful of emus were actually killed. Machine guns jammed in the dust. Trucks broke down on the rough terrain. And all the while, the birds simply sprinted away, regrouped, and returned later to feast on the wheat again. One soldier remarked that the emus seem to have developed military tactics. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks, he said. Another quipped that the only way to win was to put medals on the birds and declare them citizens. The humiliation only grew. At one point, soldiers attempted to mount a machine gun on the back of a truck to chase the birds, but the truck couldn't keep up across the scrubby land, and the bouncing made it impossible to aim. The emus outran the truck, leaving the soldiers behind in a cloud of dust. By December, after weeks of fruitless battles, the government quietly admitted defeat. The soldiers were withdrawn. The emus had won. The press had a field day. Headlines mocked the army's failure, declaring the birds victorious. Cartoons showed emus decorated like generals. Farmers grumbled that nothing had changed. The birds were still in their fields, still munching wheat, and still impossible to stop. Eventually, the government provided funding for better fencing, which proved more effective than bullets. To this day, the Emu War remains one of history's strangest military campaigns. It's hard not to chuckle at the image. Disciplined soldiers with machine guns, chasing giant birds that bob and weave across the Australian outback, and losing. The emus, oblivious to the politics and headlines, were simply doing what animals do, looking for food, running when chased, and surviving as they always had. And yet, there's something almost comforting in the story. Even with all our machines and armies, nature still has ways of humbling us. The birds, in their own accidental way, reminded us that humans don't always get the final say. Of course, it's easy to laugh at the Australians for losing a war against birds. But before we get too smug, remember, even the greatest general in history once suffered defeat at the paws of far fluffier creatures. Because years earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte himself was ambushed, not by an army, not by traitors, but by rabbits. Napoleon attacked by rabbits, 1807, France. By the summer of 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power. He had defeated the Prussians, humbled the Austrians, and was feared across Europe as a master of strategy. When he wanted to celebrate the signing of a new peace treaty, he decided on something light-hearted, a grand rabbit hunt for himself and his officers. It was meant to be a day of sport, a moment of relaxation away from the battlefield. His chief of staff arranged everything. Dozens of guests were invited, carts of food and drink were prepared, and most importantly, hundreds, some say as many as 3,000, rabbits were collected for the hunt. They were released into an open field, and the soldiers stood ready with nets and guns. The stage was set. The emperor would ride out and demonstrate not just his skill in war, but his gentlemanly flair in sport. But then, the strangest thing happened. The rabbits did not scatter. They did not bolt into the bushes or tremble in fear at the sight of soldiers. Instead, they charged. At first, Napoleon laughed. A rabbit or two hopping toward the hunters was amusing, but this was no trickle. It was a wave. Dozens, then hundreds of furry bodies bounded forward with shocking determination. They swarmed around the emperor's feet, leapt at his boots, and clawed at the hems of uniforms. One officer later described it as an onslaught. The cause, it turned out, was simple. The rabbits had not been wild. The chief of staff, pressed for time, had purchased tame rabbits from local farms. These animals were used to being fed by humans. When released into the field, they didn't see predators. They saw providers. They thought the emperor and his men had arrived with dinner. Imagine the scene. Napoleon, the conqueror of Europe, retreating in disarray from a flood of rabbits. Soldiers slapping at their trousers, officers stumbling backward, hats askew, while the rabbits chased them with single-minded hunger. The mighty emperor, who had routed armies and redrawn maps, now scrambled for his carriage. The coachman whipped the horses into motion, and still the rabbits gave chase, bounding after the rolling wheels. It was less a hunt than a farcical retreat, and the laughter of the officers could not disguise the absurdity. Napoleon himself was reportedly furious, blaming his staff for the humiliation, but no scolding could erase the memory. Napoleon Bonaparte, defeated not by generals or kings, but by rabbits looking for food. The tale spread quickly. Enemies of France delighted in the story, repeating it as proof that the emperor was not invincible. Even his allies chuckled behind closed doors. It was the kind of failure too strange to hide. After all, history has room for victories and defeats, but when the defeat involves bunnies, it tends to be remembered. Today, the rabbit attack of 1807 stands as one of the most charming oddities of Napoleon's career. It doesn't erase his triumphs at Austerlitz or Jena, but it adds a layer of humanity. Reminding us that even the most powerful figures in history were not immune to silliness. Napoleon may have crowned himself emperor, but in that moment, the rabbits crowned themselves victorious. And so, while Napoleon fought bunnies in a French field, the world kept producing conflicts even stranger. Because sometimes, what looks like a simple disagreement can spiral into full-blown international tension. Not over land, not over resources, but over a single tree. A tree that nearly started World War III. Operation Paul Bunyan, 1976, Korea. Sometimes wars are sparked by assassinations, sometimes by invasions, and sometimes by a tree. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, is one of the tensest borders on Earth. Even today, it's a strip of land bristling with soldiers, fences, and minefields. Back in 1976, it was even more volatile. American and South Korean troops patrolled one side. North Korean soldiers patrolled the other. Every move, every glance was a test of strength. In the middle of this fragile zone stood a poplar tree. It was large, leafy, and unfortunately located at an awkward bend in the road near a checkpoint. The branches were blocking the line of sight, making it difficult for UN observers to keep watch. So, on August 18th, a small group of American and South Korean soldiers were sent to trim it back. It should have been an ordinary task, a bit of landscaping, nothing more. But the North Korean soldiers on duty saw it differently. To them, this wasn't gardening, it was aggression. A confrontation began, voices were raised, and then, in a shocking burst of violence, the North Korean troops attacked with axes and clubs. When the fight was over, 2 American officers lay dead. The world held its breath. Would this incident ignite a war? Washington and Seoul wanted to respond firmly, but not recklessly. And so, in a move that feels like it belongs more to satire than strategy, they decided to cut down the tree. Not quietly, not at night, but in broad daylight with overwhelming force. The mission was named Operation Paul Bunyan, after the legendary American lumberjack said to wield an axe the size of a telephone pole. The goal was simple: remove the tree, show strength, but avoid further bloodshed. On the morning of August 21st, the operation began. A convoy of 23 American and South Korean vehicles rolled into the DMZ. In the trucks were not only lumberjacks with chainsaws, but also engineers, military police, and security teams. Hovering above, helicopters circled with snipers peering through their scopes. In the distance, artillery and tanks were ready. Even aircraft carriers were positioned offshore, just in case. All this to cut down a tree. The soldiers in charge wore sidearms, but the men with chainsaws were unarmed, a deliberate choice to show that this was, at its core, a tree trimming mission. Still, the scale of the operation was staggering. It was less about the tree itself and more about sending a message. We will not be intimidated. North Korean troops rushed to their side of the line, bristling with weapons. For 45 tense minutes, the chainsaws buzzed while hundreds of soldiers stared each other down, fingers resting on triggers. But the North never attacked. The poplar fell. And just like that, the mission was over. The absurdity was not lost on anyone. An operation involving tanks, helicopters, and warships had been carried out to cut down a single tree. But it worked. The point was made. Escalation was avoided, and the world breathed a little easier. In the years since, Operation Paul Bunyan has become one of the most bizarre shows of force in modern history. It reminds us that sometimes wars can hinge not only on armies and ideologies, but on something as simple as a tree in the wrong place. And if a tree could almost spark World War III, what about a dog? Because not long before, a runaway pup crossing a border nearly started a war of its own. Yes, a single dog. The War of the Stray Dog, 1925, Greece versus Bulgaria. Most wars begin with speeches, treaties or long-simmering rivalries. But in 1925, along the tense border between Greece and Bulgaria, war began with something far simpler: man's best friend. The Balkans had already earned a reputation as a region where small sparks could ignite big fires. Only a decade earlier, clashes in the Balkans had spiraled into World War I. So by the 1920s, every patrol, every glance across the border was loaded with tension. One October afternoon, a Greek soldier was out on routine patrol near the town of Petrish. His dog trotted beside him, loyal and cheerful as always. But dogs are curious creatures. Perhaps it caught a scent. Perhaps it saw something moving in the distance. Whatever the reason, the dog dashed across the border, straight into Bulgarian territory. The soldier, without hesitation, chased after his companion. But as he crossed the line, Bulgarian guards raised their rifles. Shots were fired. The Greek soldier fell. News traveled quickly. In Greece, outrage boiled. One of their men had been killed while simply retrieving his dog. The Greek government demanded justice. When none was offered, they decided to act. Within days, Greek troops marched into Bulgaria. It wasn't a symbolic protest, it was a full military invasion. Bulgarian villages near the border were seized. Civilians fled. Bulgarian forces scrambled to respond. What had started with a dog had become a war. Bulgaria, overwhelmed and fearing wider escalation, appealed to the League of Nations, the international peacekeeping body created after World War I. The League, eager to prove its relevance, immediately took up the case. They pressured Greece to withdraw and threatened sanctions if the fighting continued. And so, after just 10 days, the war ended. The Greeks pulled back. The Bulgarians regained their villages. The casualty count was small compared to the great wars of the century, but it was real. All because a soldier chased after his dog. The incident was officially recorded as the War of the Stray Dog. Historians sometimes argue that Greece also had larger political motives, using the incident as a convenient excuse to flex its strength. But in the popular imagination, the image that endures is simpler: a soldier running after his pup, and an entire region lurching toward conflict. It is, in many ways, both tragic and absurd. A reminder that in tense times, the smallest accidents can tip the balance, and perhaps also a quiet lesson that even man's best friend can sometimes lead us into trouble. Wars sparked by birds, rabbits, trees, and even dogs. History has no shortage of strange conflicts, but sometimes the weirdness doesn't come from what starts a war. It comes from what companies do in peace. And in the late 1980s, one soda company briefly commanded one of the largest navies in the world. Pepsi had the world's sixth largest military, 1989. Some companies grow so large they feel unstoppable. They spread across continents, build skyscrapers, and dominate advertising. But few companies can claim they once commanded a navy. Pepsi can. In the late 1980s, the Cold War was still running hot, though not at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union eyed each other warily, building weapons, launching satellites, and competing in every arena, even in soft drinks. Coca-Cola had long been the global favorite. Its red and white logo was instantly recognizable, a symbol of American culture itself. The Soviets, meanwhile, were cautious. They allowed Coke into their markets, but carefully. And so, Pepsi saw an opportunity. In 1959, Pepsi struck a deal to be sold in the USSR, making it one of the first Western consumer goods available behind the Iron Curtain. But there was a problem. The ruble, the Soviet currency, was not convertible on the world market. The Soviet Union couldn't simply buy Pepsi with cash, so the two sides arranged an unusual barter. At first, the Soviets traded vodka, stolichnaya, for Pepsi. Americans got Russian vodka in their liquor stores, and Russians got to sip fizzy cola. It worked for a while, but by the 1980s, Pepsi wanted more. The company was looking to expand further into Soviet markets, and vodka wasn't enough to cover the costs. And so, in 1989, the Soviet Union struck a new deal. This time, instead of vodka, they offered military equipment. The exchange was surreal. Pepsi received 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer in exchange for billions of dollars worth of Pepsi. For a brief moment, on paper at least, Pepsi owned one of the largest navies in the world. In fact, their fleet was so large that it ranked as the sixth biggest military force on Earth. The absurdity was not lost on Pepsi's executives. The CEO joked, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than the US government is." Of course, Pepsi had no use for a fleet of aging warships. They quickly sold the vessels to a Swedish scrapyard, turning them into profit rather than patrolling the seas. But for a flicker in time, a soda company controlled destroyers and submarines. It was as if carbonated sugar water had conquered the Cold War. The story has since become a favorite footnote of 20th century history. It shows just how strange global trade can be, how symbols of culture like soda could intersect with military might, and how even during dangerous standoffs, people found ways to exchange goods, sometimes in the most peculiar forms. For Pepsi, it was both a triumph and a curiosity. They expanded their brand deep into the Soviet Union, all while briefly becoming a naval power. And for the world, it was proof that sometimes history's oddest deals don't involve kings or generals at all, just a bottle of cola. Of course, strange things weren't limited to fleets and treaties. Sometimes, it took only a hat to spark chaos. Because in New York City, in the summer of 1922, thousands of men rioted in the streets. Not over politics, not over war, but over straw hats. The Straw Hat Riots, 1922, New York. Some fashion rules are meant to be broken. Others, apparently, start riots. In the early 20th century, men's fashion was guided by strict, sometimes bizarre traditions. One of the most peculiar rules concerned straw hats. These lightweight hats were practical in the summer heat, keeping gentlemen cool as they strolled city streets. But according to custom, once September 15th arrived, straw hats were to be retired until the following summer. Why? Because someone, somewhere, decided the date marked the start of autumn proper, and wearing a straw hat after mid-September was considered unfashionable, even laughable. For most people, such traditions were harmless, but in New York City, fashion policing sometimes turned physical. Rowdy young men would knock straw hats off the heads of those who dared wear them past the deadline. At first, it was all in jest, but in 1922, the tradition boiled over into chaos. On the evening of September 13th, 2 days before the deadline, gangs of teenagers grew impatient. Instead of waiting until the 15th, they stormed the streets, knocking hats off men's heads, stomping them flat, and jeering at the wearers. When they targeted a group of factory workers, the prank turned violent. Fists flew. The workers fought back. Police intervened. And suddenly, the whole city was swept into a bizarre wave of hat-related brawls. The following night, the riots grew. Crowds blocked traffic on major avenues, yanking hats off men in carriages and trolleys. Policemen themselves had their hats snatched, leading to scuffles between officers and pranksters. Newspapers reported that thousands joined in. Entire blocks of the city became battlefields of shredded straw. The violence spread across Manhattan and into the Bronx. Men carried walking sticks to defend their headwear. Others abandoned their hats altogether, fearing attack. Factories reported delays because workers refused to cross neighborhoods where straw hat gangs prowled. It wasn't just a fashion dispute, it was the disruption of daily life. The press dubbed it the Straw Hat Riots, and though the city chuckled at the absurdity, the incidents left bruises and broken bones. At least one man was reported hospitalized. Police arrested dozens, though most were quickly released. By the end of the week, the chaos subsided. The unwritten rule returned: no straw hats after September 15th. And though the riots never reached such scale again, the memory lingered. Proof that even something as flimsy as a hat could stir a mighty city into frenzy. Looking back, it's difficult not to laugh at the seriousness with which people treated the rule. Straw hats were never banned by law, and yet social pressure carried such weight that men risked their safety to defend their fashion choices. It was, in its own way, a reminder that humans are creatures of ritual, sometimes silly ritual, and that breaking them can provoke outsized reactions. So next time you see someone wearing white after Labor Day, remember, at least no one's rioting about it anymore. But fashion rules were not the only absurd restrictions in the 20th century. In Iceland, for over 70 years, people were forbidden to drink one of the world's most ordinary beverages, beer. Yes, beer itself was illegal. Iceland's beer ban, 1915 to 1989. For a country famous today for cozy pubs, hearty lagers, and a lively drinking culture, it's almost hard to believe that for most of the 20th century, beer was illegal in Iceland. Not just frowned upon, not just taxed heavily, outright banned. The story begins in 1915 when Iceland held a referendum on alcohol. It was part of a global temperance movement where many nations worried about the social harms of drinking. The vote was decisive. Icelanders chose to outlaw all alcohol. For a time, the nation went dry, but bans, as history often shows, rarely last long. Wine made its way back in 1922 when Spain threatened to stop importing Icelandic fish unless Iceland allowed Spanish wine in return. By 1935, spirits like vodka and schnapps were legalized too after a public referendum. So whiskey and aquavit were back on the shelves, but beer, defined as anything stronger than 2.25% alcohol, remained illegal. Why? Because lawmakers feared beer would be too cheap and too tempting. Wine and liquor were expensive, the thinking went, so people might drink responsibly. But beer, being affordable and easy to gulp down, might lead to rowdy drunkenness. And so, decade after decade, the ban lingered. The result was strange. You could order a shot of Brennivin, Iceland's potent schnapps nicknamed Black Death, with no problem. But ask for a pint of lager and you were out of luck. Locals sometimes joked about the absurdity. Tourists scratched their heads, and creative Icelanders found ways around the rule. Bartenders invented a drink called a Pilsner cocktail, mixing low-alcohol beer with a shot of liquor to simulate the taste of a proper brew. Homebrewers secretly experimented in kitchens and garages, and travelers returning from abroad often smuggled in cans of beer as if they were contraband. By the 1970s and 80s, public opinion had shifted. Younger generations saw the ban as outdated and silly. Political debates flared. Finally, in 1989, after 74 years of prohibition, the Icelandic parliament voted to lift the ban. On March 1st, beer became legal again. The people celebrated immediately. Bars poured foamy pints. Shops stocked imported lagers. And since then, March 1st has been marked every year as Beer Day in Iceland. It's not just a holiday. It's a small festival of freedom where locals raise a glass to the end of a strangely long prohibition. Looking back, the beer ban feels like a contradiction. Why allow vodka but not lager? Why trust people with strong spirits but not with something milder? And yet, laws often reflect the anxieties of their time. For Iceland in the early 20th century, beer symbolized rowdiness, while liquor was seen as a luxury. Today, of course, the ban is more of a curiosity, a story locals tell with a smile as they pour you a frosty pint in Reykjavik. But it stands as another example of how human rules can be, at times, as peculiar as they are serious. But if banning beer seemed odd, some rulers took eccentricity even further. Consider the Roman Emperor Caligula, who once declared war on the sea itself, ordering his soldiers to stab the waves and collect seashells as trophies. Caligula declares war on the sea, 39 CE, Rome. The Roman Empire had seen its fair share of eccentric rulers, but few earned a reputation as strange, or as infamous as Caligula. His reign, which began in the year 37 CE, was short but legendary for its excesses, cruelty, and odd displays of power. Among the many bizarre stories told about him, one stands out as both ridiculous and unforgettable: the time he declared war on the ocean. The year was 39 CE. Rome was preparing for another campaign in Gaul, across the Channel from Britain. Caligula, eager to prove himself as a warrior emperor like Julius Caesar before him, marched his legions northward. But once they reached the shores of the English Channel, instead of launching an invasion, Caligula unveiled a different plan. He ordered his soldiers to line up along the beach, armor glinting, shields at the ready. The enemy, he proclaimed, was not another army. It was Neptune, the god of the sea. Caligula declared war against the ocean itself. At his command, the soldiers charged into the surf, stabbing at the waves with their spears and swinging their swords against the tide. The surf splashed back, unbothered. It must have been a sight. Thousands of disciplined Roman legionaries flailing against water, obeying orders that surely made little sense even to them. And then, after this watery battle, Caligula commanded them to collect spoils of victory. But there were no enemy weapons to seize, no captured standards to parade back to Rome. So he told them to gather seashells. Seashells, he declared, were the spoils of war, proof of their triumph over Neptune's domain. The shells were collected in baskets and carted away as if they were precious treasure. When Caligula later staged a triumphal procession in Rome, he presented these shells as though they were the riches of a conquered land. Why did he do it? Historians have argued about that for centuries. Some believe Caligula was simply insane, consumed by delusions of grandeur. Others suggest he may have been mocking his own soldiers, or sending a political message too subtle or too bizarre for us to fully grasp today. Perhaps he meant to symbolize Rome's dominance over the natural world, to show that nothing, not even the sea, could resist his power. Whatever the motive, the episode became one of the most memorable anecdotes of his reign. It turned a mighty emperor into the butt of jokes for generations. Even Roman historians, who were often reluctant to criticize emperors openly, could not resist recording the absurdity. And yet, in its strangeness, the story carries a kind of poetry. A man hailed as the most powerful in the world, swinging swords at waves. The sea, eternal and indifferent, rolling back with every tide. The shells, delicate and beautiful, collected as tokens of conquest. It is a reminder that power, unchecked, can drift into parody. That sometimes the people who rule empires make decisions that are remembered not for their wisdom, but for their oddity. And it is also a reminder that history is full of moments so surreal they could be mistaken for satire, except they truly happened. Today, the phrase Caligula's War on the Sea is often used as shorthand for pointless battles, futile gestures, and grand shows that achieve nothing. But in the calm telling of it now, late at night, it feels less like madness and more like a strange dream from long ago, a dream in which emperors fought oceans and seashells were spoils of war. And while Caligula waged his strange campaign against the sea, history shows that sometimes animals, not gods or men, became the strangest soldiers of all. Which brings us to a remarkable bear, one who fought alongside humans, carried ammunition in battle, and became a beloved comrade in arms. The Polish Army's enlisted bear, Wojtek, World War II. Not all soldiers walk on two legs. Some march on four, though very few have paws, claws, and a taste for beer. One of the most extraordinary stories of World War II involves just such a soldier, Wojtek the bear, a comrade of the Polish army. The tale begins in 1942, when a group of Polish soldiers, evacuated from Soviet labor camps, were traveling through the Middle East. In Iran, they came across a young shepherd boy carrying a tiny brown bear cub. The cub's mother had been killed, and the boy was trying to sell the orphaned animal. Moved by pity and perhaps a sense of whimsy, the soldiers pooled their money and bought the cub. They named him Wojtek, pronounced Wojtek, a Slavic name meaning joyful warrior. At first, he was small enough to fit in their arms. The men fed him condensed milk from bottles, taught him to play like a puppy, and treated him as a kind of living mascot. But bears grow quickly. By the time Wojtek was full grown, he stood nearly 6 feet tall on his hind legs and weighed over 450 pounds. Yet despite his size, he was gentle with the soldiers. He followed them around like a loyal dog. He loved to wrestle playfully, often letting men climb on him as he rolled in the sand. He had a soft spot for sweets, fruit, and most famously, beer. The soldiers would hand him bottles, which he tipped back clumsily, guzzling the drink before licking the glass clean. He also developed a taste for cigarettes, not smoking them, but eating them, to the delight of his companions. Wojtek soon became more than a mascot. When the Polish Second Corps moved into combat zones, rules forbade animals as mascots, so the soldiers solved the problem by officially enlisting him. Wojtek was given a service number, a rank of private, and a place on the payroll. He was, quite literally, a soldier. His most famous moment came in 1944, during the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy, one of the fiercest campaigns of the war. As artillery shells thundered and men scrambled to carry ammunition, Wojtek joined in. To the amazement of all, the bear hoisted heavy crates of mortar shells in his great paws and carried them to the front. Calm and steady, he worked alongside the men, unfazed by the chaos around him. After the battle, the soldiers adopted a new emblem for their unit, the image of a bear carrying a shell. It was a tribute to Wojtek, their comrade who had proven as brave and dependable as any man. When the war ended, Wojtek traveled with the Polish troops to Scotland. There he lived in relative peace, though he never lost his playful spirit. He became a local celebrity, visiting with children, entertaining visitors with his antics, and reminding everyone of the strange, beautiful friendships that emerge in wartime. Wojtek lived until 1963, spending his final years in the Edinburgh Zoo, where Polish veterans often visited to salute their old comrade. He had started life as an orphaned cub, but became a soldier, a symbol, and a legend. Today, statues of Wojtek stand in both Scotland and Poland. He is remembered not just as a curiosity, but as a reminder of the resilience of soldiers who found companionship in the unlikeliest of forms. In the darkest days of war, a bear helped carry the burden, literally and figuratively. And so, from bears who carried shells, we turn to people who carried themselves into exhaustion. Because in Strasbourg, in 1518, crowds of men and women danced day and night, not for joy, not for celebration, but because they could not stop. It was the strange and unsettling episode known as the Dancing Plague. The Dancing Plague, 1518, Strasbourg. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, was gripped by one of the strangest public health crises in recorded history. It wasn't plague in the usual sense, with fever or coughing. It was a plague of dancing. It began quietly, almost innocently, with a woman named Frau Trophäa. On a hot July day, she stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no reason. She just started moving, swaying, spinning, stepping in rhythm only she seemed to hear. At first, neighbors may have smiled, but as the hours passed, concern grew. Frau Trophäa did not stop. She danced through the afternoon, into the evening, and into the night. When exhaustion overtook her, she collapsed, only to rise again the next morning and continue. Within days, others joined her. One by one, men and women began to twitch, shuffle, and spin uncontrollably. By the end of the week, dozens of people were dancing in the streets. They couldn't explain why. They didn't seem able to resist. It was as if the city itself had been bewitched. As the numbers grew, so did the alarm. Chroniclers wrote that the dancers moved until their feet bled, until their bodies ached, until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion, only to rise and dance again. Some reportedly suffered heart attacks or strokes from the strain, and still, the musicless frenzy went on. The city council was baffled. At first, they thought the cure was more dancing. They cleared guild halls and built a stage, even hiring musicians to provide accompaniment. The logic seemed to be, if this energy needed release, better to let it burn itself out in an organized way. But the opposite happened. The music only fueled the madness. The crowd swelled. By some accounts, over 400 people were caught up in the strange epidemic. What caused it? Historians still debate. Some point to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and produces hallucinogenic effects similar to LSD. If the city's bread supply had been contaminated, perhaps it triggered mass convulsions and delirium. Others argue it was a form of mass hysteria brought on by stress, famine, and disease. Medieval Strasbourg was under heavy strain at the time, with poverty and illness weighing on the people. Perhaps the dancing was a psychological escape, that spiraled out of control. Whatever the cause, the dancing plague lasted for weeks. Finally, city leaders banned music altogether and ordered the dancers to be taken to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and, ironically, of epilepsy. There, prayers were offered, and gradually, the outbreak faded. But the memory lingered. For centuries, the dancing plague of 1518 was cited as proof of divine punishment, witchcraft, or human folly. Today, it remains one of history's most baffling medical mysteries. It's hard to imagine the scene without thinking of it as both tragic and darkly comic. Hundreds of people, compelled by forces they couldn't explain, spinning endlessly in the streets while bewildered neighbors watched. It's the kind of story that would sound like folklore, except the records are too clear to ignore. And perhaps that's what makes it such a perfect piece of history's oddities. A reminder that sometimes humans don't need enemies or disasters to create chaos. Sometimes our own minds and bodies do the work for us. From endless dancing to endless stickiness, the next strange disaster wasn't caused by music or madness, but by sugar. Because in 1919, a massive tank burst in Boston, sending a wave of molasses rushing through the city streets. The Great Molasses Flood, 1919, Boston. Most disasters in history involve fire, explosions, or storms. But in Boston, on a cold January day in 1919, the disaster came in the form of something far stickier: molasses. The story begins with a massive storage tank built along Commercial Street in Boston's North End. The tank was enormous, over 50 feet tall, holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. It belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, which used molasses to make industrial alcohol, a key ingredient in munitions during World War I. By the winter of 1919, the war was over, but the tank was still full, waiting to be processed. On January 15th, the temperature in Boston had risen rapidly after a cold snap. The steel tank, already poorly constructed and prone to leaks, groaned under the sudden expansion of the thick, sugary liquid. Around midday, with the sound like gunfire, the tank gave way. What followed was one of the strangest disasters the city had ever seen. A wave of molasses, some 25 feet high at its peak, rushed through the streets at nearly 35 miles per hour. It swept away everything in its path. Horses were knocked off their feet, wagons were overturned, buildings were crushed like toys. People were caught in the flood before they could even react. Molasses may seem harmless in a jar on your breakfast table, but in a tidal wave, it is terrifying. The sticky liquid trapped anyone it touched, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. Some residents were pinned against walls or buried under the slow-moving, suffocating mass. Firefighters later recalled that the cries for help were muffled, as if the city itself were being smothered. The disaster killed 21 people and injured more than 100. Rescue efforts were grim and exhausting. Workers waded through waist-deep syrup, their boots sucked into the muck with every step. Horses struggled and often had to be put down when they couldn't be freed. And when the cleanup began, it became clear the stickiness would not go away quickly. For weeks, the north end smelled of sugar. The molasses-coated buildings seeped into basements and glued the cobblestones together. Hoses of salt water were used to wash it away, but even months later, the neighborhood remained tacky underfoot. Some said the harbor itself was brown with molasses for years afterward. When lawsuits followed, investigators discovered what locals already suspected. The tank had been shoddily built. Residents had noticed it leaking long before the collapse, and the company had simply painted it brown to hide the problem. The court ruled the company liable, and victims were awarded damages. It was one of the earliest major class action lawsuits in U.S. history. Today, the Great Molasses Flood is remembered with a mix of horror and humor. It was deadly, yet absurd. It revealed the dangers of industrial negligence, yet left behind the surreal image of a city drowning in syrup. Bostonians who lived through it never forgot the smell or the strange, sticky weeks that followed. And though more than a century has passed, the story endures, proof that sometimes history's tragedies arrive, not with fire and fury, but with sugar and stickiness. But if molasses could bring a city to its knees, dynamite once turned a whale into an even stranger disaster. Because in Oregon, in 1970, officials tried to dispose of a dead whale on the beach with explosives, and the result was as messy as you might imagine. The exploding whale, 1970 Oregon. Most problems on a beach involve sunburn, sand in your shoes, or the occasional jellyfish sting. But in November of 1970, the small town of Florence, Oregon, faced a much larger problem. Quite literally large, an 8-ton sperm whale had washed ashore and died. A whale carcass is not something you can simply ignore. At first, locals were curious, wandering down to the beach to take a look. But as days passed, curiosity turned to disgust. The whale began to rot in the sun. The smell was overwhelming, a thick, rancid stench that clung to the air and drifted for miles. The body itself grew more grotesque by the hour, swelling with gases as decomposition set in. The authorities had to act. But how do you get rid of a whale that weighs as much as a bus? Burying it wasn't practical. The sand was too shallow. Cutting it up and hauling it away seemed impossible, both because of the size and the sheer unpleasantness of the task. So the Oregon Highway Division, which was somehow given responsibility for the problem, came up with an unusual plan. They would blow it up. The idea was simple in theory. Use explosives to break the whale into smaller pieces, which would then be eaten by gulls, crabs, and other scavengers. Nature would do the cleanup with just a little help from dynamite. The engineers set to work, calculating the placement of the charges. They decided on 1/2 ton of dynamite, placed on the landward side of the whale to push the remains toward the sea. On November 12th, a crowd gathered to watch. Reporters, locals, and curious onlookers lined the dunes, waiting for the show. At precisely 3:45 in the afternoon, the countdown began, and then, boom, the explosion shook the beach, sending sand and smoke into the sky. For a brief moment, it looked like the plan had worked, but then the rain began, not of water, but of whale. Chunks of blubber, some as small as pebbles, and others the size of suitcases, flew through the air. The smell was indescribable. Spectators screamed and scrambled for cover as fatty debris pelted the beach. One enormous piece crashed down on a car, flattening its roof. Smaller chunks splattered houses and yards blocks away. As the smoke cleared, the reality set in. The whale was not gone. Yes, parts of it had been blasted apart, but the largest sections remained stubbornly intact. Worse, the beach was now littered with greasy, rancid meat that seagulls wanted nothing to do with. Instead of solving the problem, the explosion had spread it far and wide. In the end, heavy machinery had to be brought in to bury what was left. The cleanup took days, and the story took on a life of its own. The footage of the exploding whale, captured by a local news crew, became one of the first viral videos decades later, replayed on blooper reels, and shared widely on the internet. Today, the exploding whale of Oregon is remembered less as a tragedy and more as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that creative solutions are not always good solutions, and that sometimes, when faced with a giant problem, the simplest option, bury it quietly, may be the best one. But not all strange ideas came from bungling bureaucrats. Some came from dreamers and visionaries, people who tried to build something entirely new, like Ernest Hemingway's brother, who once founded his own tiny nation on nothing more than a raft. New Atlantis, founded by Hemingway's brother, 1964, Caribbean. History is filled with dreamers who tried to found their own countries. Some carved out land through war. Others declared independence in forgotten corners of the world. But few went about it quite like Lester Hemingway, the younger brother of the famous author Ernest Hemingway. Lester was a writer in his own right, though never as celebrated as Ernest. What he lacked in fame, he made up for in imagination. In 1964, inspired by a mix of idealism and whimsy, Lester decided he would start a brand new nation. Not in the mountains, not in the desert, but floating in the Caribbean Sea. Armed with a small grant and a bold idea, he built a raft. It wasn't an ordinary raft of logs lashed together. It was carefully constructed from bamboo, steel piping, and pontoons, measuring about 8 by 30 feet. On top, he placed a small hut for shelter and painted a flag of his own design. This floating contraption, anchored about 8 miles off the coast of Jamaica, was declared the independent nation of New Atlantis. Lester announced his new country with flair. He proclaimed himself the head of state, though with modesty. He styled himself not as king or president, but as president for life. He drafted a constitution, printed his own currency, and even issued stamps. The stamps, featuring fish and sea motifs, were sold as souvenirs to collectors, and surprisingly, they brought in a bit of money. Why did he do it? Partly, Lester said, to promote marine research. He envisioned New Atlantis as a platform for ocean science, a place where experiments could be conducted away from bureaucratic red tape. But partly, it seems, he simply wanted to prove it could be done. The idea of declaring a sovereign state on the high seas appealed to his playful, adventurous side. For a time, New Atlantis gained attention. Newspapers ran stories about the Hemingway brother who had launched his own nation. Tourists and journalists visited, marveling at the tiny hut bobbing on the waves. Lester proudly handed out citizenship papers, which were little more than signed certificates. In his mind, New Atlantis was both a joke and a genuine experiment in independence. Unfortunately, the sea is not a gentle landlord. Within a few years, storms battered the raft until it finally sank beneath the waves. New Atlantis was no more. Still, Lester's venture lives on in memory as one of the oddest experiments in micronations. Unlike most utopian projects, it was small, harmless, and oddly endearing. A tiny country, born not from war or conquest, but from one man's imagination, some bamboo, and a flag fluttering in the Caribbean breeze. In a way, Lester achieved something remarkable. For a brief moment, he created a space that was both a political statement and a whimsical work of art. And though New Atlantis vanished beneath the waves, the story of its existence continues to float through history, like a raft that refuses to sink entirely. But while Hemingway's brother dreamed of building a nation at sea, others looked skyward in fear. Because in 1910, when Halley's Comet blazed across the sky, entrepreneurs sold pills that claimed to protect people from poisonous comet gas. Anti-comet pills. 1910, Halley's Comet. Every 76 years, like clockwork, Halley's Comet returns to Earth's skies. For centuries, its glowing tail filled people with awe. But in 1910, awe turned into something else entirely: fear. Astronomers announced that as Halley's Comet swept past Earth that year, the planet would actually pass through part of its glowing tail. Today, we understand that a comet's tail is made of dust and gas, spread thin across millions of miles. But in 1910, scientific knowledge was less widespread, and the press eagerly stoked the public's imagination. Newspapers printed dramatic headlines about poison gases in the comet's trail. Some scientists speculated, perhaps unwisely, that traces of cyanogen, a toxic compound, might be present in the tail. Though they knew it was harmless in such dilute form, the nuance was lost in translation. The public panicked. Across Europe and America, people whispered about doomsday. Would the air turn toxic? Would crops wither? Would the comet snuff out all life on Earth? Opportunists saw an opening. If people feared the sky was falling, why not sell them protection? And so, in cities large and small, vendors began hawking so-called anti-comet pills. The pills promised to neutralize the poison gases. Some were little more than sugar tablets. Others contained strong herbs or even laxatives, on the theory that if your body was purged, you'd be safe. Not to be outdone, other entrepreneurs offered anti-comet umbrellas coated with special chemicals to shield the user from celestial toxins. There were even rumors of comet masks filled with absorbent powders, advertised as filtering out deadly vapors. People bought them eagerly. In a world before consumer protection laws, no one checked the claims. If it sounded scientific, that was enough. Drugstores sold out, street vendors shouted about safety, and those who couldn't afford the remedies prayed instead, gathering in churches to wait out the comet's arrival. When the night finally came in May 1910, crowds gathered in the streets, staring up nervously. And then, just as astronomers had predicted, Earth passed through the comet's tail. There were no deadly gases, no crops died, no people collapsed in the streets. The world kept turning, and Halley's comet drifted away once more. The pills, of course, were revealed as useless. But the episode became a perfect example of how human imagination, fueled by fear and clever marketing, can turn a cosmic event into a commercial opportunity. Looking back, it's hard not to smile at the idea of anti-comet umbrellas and miracle tablets. But the story also holds a quiet lesson. Whenever uncertainty looms, there will always be those who sell reassurance, bottled, packaged, and priced just right. And perhaps that too is part of human history. We fear, we imagine, we invent, and sometimes we swallow sugar pills to soothe our worries while the stars pass overhead. But while some people looked to the skies in fear, others kept their eyes firmly on the ground. In 13th century Mongolia, a warrior princess challenged every man who sought her hand in marriage to defeat her in wrestling. None ever did. Her name was Kutulun, and she remained undefeated. Kutulun, the undefeated wrestling woman, 13th century Mongolia. The Mongol Empire produced many fierce warriors, but few were as unique or as formidable as Kutulun, a princess who turned marriage into a wrestling match. Kutulun was born in the late 13th century, the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan himself. Her father, Kaidu, was a powerful ruler in Central Asia, constantly engaged in wars against both rivals and distant relatives. In such a world, children of the steppe were expected to ride horses, shoot arrows, and fight. Kutulun did all of that, and more. From a young age, she showed a remarkable gift for wrestling, or bok, the traditional sport of the Mongols. It wasn't a mere pastime. Wrestling was a central part of Mongol culture, celebrated at festivals and gatherings. Champions were honored, songs were sung of their victories, and reputations were built in the dust of the wrestling ground. Kutulun entered the ring against men, not women, and she beat them over and over again. But it wasn't just her athleticism that made her famous. It was the way she combined it with her stance on marriage. As stories tell it, Kutulun declared she would only marry a man who could defeat her in wrestling. Until then, she would remain single. This was no idle boast. She wrestled hundreds of suitors from noble warriors to ambitious challengers, and none could topple her. Each time a man failed, Mongol custom allowed Kutulun to claim a prize from him, often horses. Her herd grew immense, numbering in the thousands, as she tossed one suitor after another into the dirt. Imagine the scene. A proud warrior stepping into the circle, muscles tense, convinced he might be the one. The crowd gathers, dust swirls, and Kutulun, clad in her wrestling tunic, grips him firmly. Moments later, with a swift twist of technique, the man finds himself flat on his back, staring at the sky. The crowd roars. Kutulun claims another horse, and the challenger limps away, humiliated. Her fame spread far and wide. Marco Polo, traveling through the region, wrote of her with awe. He described her as the greatest wrestler in her father's realm, undefeated in every contest. He even hinted that Kaidu once hoped to make her his successor, so great was her strength and loyalty. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Some critics whispered that her refusal to marry was unbecoming of a princess. Rumors swirled that she was too proud, or that she shared too close a bond with her father. But the truth was simpler. Kutulun lived life on her own terms, refusing to bend to expectations. Eventually, she did marry, though not through defeat on the wrestling ground. Her husband's name has been lost to time, overshadowed entirely by her legend. What endured was not who she wed, but the fact that she had forced every suitor to see her as an equal, if not their better. Kutulun died around 1306, still a respected leader and warrior. Her story remained part of Mongol folklore for centuries, retold as proof of strength, independence, and pride. Even today, in modern Mongolia, wrestling champions sometimes honor her by tying a small piece of white cloth to their uniforms, said to represent her spirit. She may not have expanded empires like her ancestor Genghis, but in her own way, she conquered every challenger who dared face her. Her victories left behind not just herds of horses, but a story that still gallops through history. But if Kutulun's story shows how life can end in triumph, the next tale shows how it can end in absurdity. Because the father of tragedy himself, the playwright Aeschylus, is said to have died not on a battlefield, but from a turtle dropped on his head by an eagle. The father of tragedy's tragic, comic death. Aeschylus, 456 BCE. Some people are remembered for how they lived, others for how they died. And in the case of Aeschylus, the father of Greek tragedy, his death has become one of history's strangest ironies. Aeschylus was born in the 6th century BCE and helped shape Greek theater into the art form we still know today. Before him, plays were little more than chants or dialogues between a single actor and a chorus. Aeschylus expanded the stage, adding more actors, more dialogue, and more drama. His works explored themes of fate, justice, and the will of the gods. He was, in every sense, a man devoted to tragedy. Yet the way he left the world was far more comic than tragic. The story goes that in 456 BCE, Aeschylus was in Sicily, away from Athens. By then he was an older man, bald, and well known, not just as a playwright, but as a veteran of battles like Marathon and Salamis. He had lived a life of both art and action, but none of that mattered when an eagle mistook his head for a rock. Here's how it happened. Eagles, especially in the Mediterranean, often eat turtles. But turtles have hard shells that are difficult to crack. The birds developed a clever solution. They scoop up the turtle in their talons, soar high into the sky, and then drop it onto a rock. The shell shatters, and the eagle enjoys its meal. One day, Aeschylus was walking outside the city of Gela in Sicily when an eagle spotted him. Perhaps his bald head glistened in the sun. Perhaps from high above, it looked like the perfect rock. The eagle swooped, clutching a turtle in its claws, and released it over the unsuspecting playwright. The turtle struck Aeschylus on the skull, killing him instantly. The eagle, no doubt, circled back, disappointed to find not a stone, but a human, and thus ended the life of the father of tragedy, felled not by war or plague, but by lunch. The story became legend, repeated by later historians like Pliny the Elder. Some even suggested that Aeschylus had been warned by an oracle that a house would collapse on him, and so he had chosen to spend time outdoors, far from buildings. If true, the irony deepens. By avoiding a roof, he made himself the perfect rock for a hungry eagle. For centuries, his death has been retold with a mix of respect and amusement. It's impossible not to smile at the absurdity, even as we acknowledge the loss of a great artist. After all, here was a man who wrote plays about the cruel twists of fate, only to meet a fate so bizarre it could have been written as a parody of his own work. Today, Aeschylus is remembered for masterpieces like the Orestia, for pushing Greek theatre forward, and for influencing every dramatist who followed. But in the quiet corners of history, he is also remembered for his strange end. It's proof that no matter how lofty our achievements, sometimes the universe writes the final act with its own peculiar sense of humor. And if a great playwright could be undone by a turtle, imagine what chaos could unfold on the world's biggest stage of sport. Because in 1904, at the Olympic Games in St. Louis, the marathon turned into one of the most bizarre races ever run. The 1904 Olympic Marathon, St. Louis. The Olympic Games are meant to showcase the peak of human endurance and athleticism. But in 1904, during the St. Louis Games, the marathon became less a noble contest and more a comedy of errors, an event so mismanaged and bizarre that it remains one of the strangest races in history. The course was set for 24.85 miles, winding along dusty roads under the sweltering Missouri sun. Temperatures soared above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads weren't paved, but packed with dirt, churned up by horses and automobiles. As runners gasped for air, they inhaled thick clouds of dust. It was less like a marathon and more like running through a desert storm. To make matters worse, organizers had a questionable idea. They wanted to test the limits of dehydration. So instead of offering water stations along the route, they placed only one, about halfway through. Runners staggered under the heat, lips parched, throats coated in grit, while spectators cheered and wagons kicked up more dust around them. The participants themselves were just as colorful as the conditions. One runner, a Cuban postman named Felix Carvajal, showed up in long trousers and street shoes. He cut his pants into makeshift shorts with a pair of scissors and set off, grinning. Along the way, he stole peaches from an orchard and ate rotten apples that made him sick. He collapsed in stomach pain, slept it off, then rejoined the race anyway. Another runner, an American named Fred Laws, collapsed from exhaustion after 9 miles. He hitched a ride in a passing car, waved to spectators along the route, and eventually jogged into the stadium looking fresh. The crowd roared, believing he had won. It took only minutes for officials to realize he had cheated. Laws was banned, though, oddly, he was later reinstated and went on to run legitimate races. Then there was Thomas Hicks, who actually finished first. But his victory came at a cost. Exhausted and dehydrated, he was given a mixture of raw egg whites, brandy, and strychnine, a toxic stimulant, in an effort to keep him going. Half carried by his trainers, wobbling and barely conscious, Hicks stumbled across the finish line. He was declared the winner, though he looked more like a man escaping death than celebrating triumph. Meanwhile, another competitor, a South African runner named Len Taunyan, faced his own obstacles. Taunyan, one of the first black Africans to compete in the Olympics, was forced off course by wild dogs, adding an unexpected chase to his marathon. By the end, the event was less about athletic excellence and more about survival and farce. Of the 32 runners who started, only 14 finished. Several nearly died from heat stroke or exhaustion. The medical staff was overwhelmed, and the reputation of the marathon, meant to be an inspiring test of endurance, instead became a cautionary tale. Today, the 1904 Olympic Marathon is remembered as one of the most chaotic sporting events ever staged. It combined poor planning, extreme conditions, and eccentric characters into a spectacle that was equal parts tragedy and comedy. If the spirit of the Olympics is to push human limits, then perhaps this race did just that, but in all the wrong ways. But if the Olympics proved absurd in 1904, the church outdid even that. Because centuries earlier, in Rome, a pope was put on trial, despite being very much dead. It was the infamous Cadaver Synod. The Cadaver Synod, 897 CE, Rome. The Middle Ages were full of strange spectacles, but few can rival the sight of a dead pope being dragged into court to stand trial. This extraordinary episode, remembered as the Cadaver Synod, took place in Rome in the year 897 CE. The pope at the center of it was Formosus, who had died the year before. In life, Formosus was a complicated figure, embroiled in the shifting politics of the time, caught between powerful Italian families and the Holy Roman Empire. He made enemies as easily as he made alliances, but death, one might think, would have freed him from political quarrels. One might think wrong. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, despised Formosus. He accused him of corruption, of scheming, of breaking church law. And so, Stephen arranged something unprecedented. He ordered that Formosus' corpse be dug up, dressed in papal robes, and placed on trial. Imagine the scene. In the Lateran Basilica, the highest court of the church convened. The air was heavy with incense. The judges sat in solemn rows, and at the center, on a throne, was the decomposing body of Formosus, propped up in ceremonial vestments. His skin was shriveled, his eyes sunken, yet his dead hand still wore the papal ring. A deacon was assigned to speak for him, answering questions on behalf of the corpse. The charges were read aloud: usurping the papacy, violating church canons, serving as bishop while holding another office. The deacon mumbled responses, but of course the outcome was predetermined. Formosus was found guilty. The punishments were grim and symbolic. His papal robes were stripped away. The 3 fingers he had once used for blessings were cut off. His body was declared unworthy, dragged through the streets, and finally thrown into the Tiber River. The spectacle horrified many in Rome. Even in an age of relics and rituals, parading a corpse in court felt like sacrilege. Crowds grew restless. Whispers of revolt spread. Within months, Pope Stephen VI was deposed and imprisoned. He was later strangled in his cell, his reign collapsing under the weight of his own grotesque theater. Ironically, Formosus's body did not stay dishonored. Fishermen pulled it from the river, and soon it was reburied with respect. Later, popes annulled the verdict, declaring the trial invalid. But the memory lingered. The time Rome's church leaders put a corpse on trial, as if death itself could not silence political grudges. Historians still debate the motives behind the cadaver synod. Was Stephen simply mad? Was it a calculated attempt to please powerful families who hated Formosus? Or was it part of a broader struggle for influence between Rome and rival kingdoms? Whatever the reason, the episode endures as one of history's strangest court cases. It is a reminder that power, mixed with spite, can twist rituals into farce, and that sometimes even the most sacred institutions stage spectacles that belong more to dark comedy than to solemn history. And if Rome once reeked of corruption in its courts, London once simply reeked. So badly, in fact, that the stench of the River Thames in 1858 shut down Parliament itself. It became known as the Great Stink of London. The Great Stink of London, 1858. In the summer of 1858, London faced a crisis unlike any other. It wasn't war or fire. It wasn't famine or plague. It was smell. A smell so powerful, so overwhelming, that it forced the mighty British Parliament to abandon its chambers. This episode is remembered forever as the Great Stink of London, The River Thames was at the heart of the problem. For centuries, Londoners had treated the river as a convenient dumping ground. Household waste, industrial runoff, and, most alarmingly, raw sewage, all poured straight into its waters. By the 19th century, the city's population had exploded, and so had the filth. Cesspools overflowed, drains clogged, and the river became a sluggish brown soup of refuse. Normally, the stench was bad but bearable, but in 1858, an unusually hot summer turned the Thames into a steaming cauldron of rot. The sun baked the river until it frothed and bubbled with decay. The smell drifted over the city like an invisible fog. Londoners described it as unbearable, gag-inducing, a stench that clung to clothes and hair. For those who lived along the riverbanks, daily life became a torment. Windows had to be sealed with lime-soaked curtains. Boating was impossible. Even ferrymen refused to work, unwilling to row through what they called liquid horror. And for Parliament, located right on the river's edge at Westminster, the smell was simply intolerable. Inside the grand chambers, politicians tried to continue their debates, but the odor seeped in through every crack. Some members pressed handkerchiefs to their noses, soaked in cologne. Others simply fled the room mid-sentence. At last, the government had no choice but to adjourn. The business of the empire was halted by smell. The great stink, for all its misery, accomplished what years of debate had not. It spurred real reform. London's leaders finally acknowledged that the city needed a modern sewer system. They turned to a brilliant engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, who designed massive new sewers to carry waste away from the Thames. Construction began soon after, and over the following years, London was transformed. Bazalgette's system not only cleared the stench, but also saved countless lives by reducing outbreaks of cholera, which had plagued the city for decades. His sewers were so well built that many still serve London today. In the end, the Great Stink became less a punchline than a turning point, a moment when unbearable smell forced action that reshaped the city for generations. And yet, it's impossible not to smile at the image. The world's most powerful lawmakers driven from their halls, not by protest or rebellion, but by the sheer stink of the river outside. History often turns on drama, but sometimes it turns on odor. And if rivers could rebel, windows could too. Because in Prague, in 1618, a group of furious politicians settled their disputes by hurling their rivals straight out the castle windows, an act so dramatic it helped spark a war. The Defenestrations of Prague, 1618. Politics can be messy, but in Prague, in the early 17th century, it became downright dangerous, especially if you happened to be near a window. The word defenestration literally means the act of throwing someone out of a window. It's a strange word, one that you don't hear very often. Yet in Prague, it has been used more than once, because the city's political disputes were settled in just such a dramatic fashion. The most famous of these incidents took place in 1618, and it didn't just end with broken glass. It helped ignite a war that would consume much of Europe. The stage was set by religious tension. Bohemia, which encompassed Prague, was a land divided between Catholics and Protestants. When Catholic leaders tried to assert more control, Protestant nobles resisted. Anger grew, petitions were ignored, and resentment simmered like a pot about to boil over. On May 23, 1618, a group of Protestant nobles stormed into Prague Castle to confront two Catholic royal governors. The meeting was heated from the start. Accusations flew. Voices rose. The governors insisted they were enforcing the will of the king. The nobles insisted their freedoms were being trampled. And then, words turned into action. Seizing the governors, the nobles dragged them across the chamber to a tall window. With little ceremony, they heaved them out. The men plummeted nearly 70 feet down into the castle's moat. An aide who tried to intervene was tossed after them. Miraculously, all three survived. Catholic accounts later claimed angels had guided them safely to the ground. Protestant accounts insisted the truth was less heavenly. The moat was filled with manure, which cushioned their fall. Whether it was divine intervention or a particularly unpleasant landing, the result was the same. The men lived. But the consequences of that defenestration were enormous. The dramatic act of rebellion signaled open defiance against Habsburg rule. It lit the fuse of the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, which dragged on until 1648 and left much of Central Europe devastated. Looking back, it's both grim and strangely absurd. A war that reshaped the continent began not with a formal declaration, not with an invasion, but with men being hurled out of a window. The windows of Prague, it seems, had a habit of shaping history. In fact, this wasn't even the city's first defenestration. Earlier, in 1419, a similar act of window throwing had also sparked unrest. For Prague, defenestration was practically a political tradition. Today, tourists still visit Prague Castle, where guides point out the famous window. It looks ordinary enough, tall, elegant, part of the Gothic architecture of the fortress. But standing there, it's hard not to imagine the sudden chaos of that moment in 1618. The shouting nobles, the struggling governors, the brief silence as bodies tumbled through the air, and the thud or squelch of the landing below. It's a reminder that history's turning points aren't always dignified. Sometimes they're messy, impulsive, and faintly ridiculous, and yet they change the world all the same. And so, from emus and rabbits to bears and dancers, from molasses floods to exploding whales, from straw hats to defenestrations, we've wandered through 20 of the strangest true events in human history. But before we drift off completely, let's close with a gentle reflection, an outro, to remind us why these odd little moments matter. The dancing donkeys of World War I. The First World War is remembered for its trenches, its mud, and its terrible cost. But amid the misery, soldiers clung to small comforts, songs, letters from home, and sometimes animals. Dogs and pigeons carried messages, cats hunted rats, and then there were the donkeys. Donkeys were hardy creatures, well suited to the battlefields. They hauled supplies, carried wounded men, and trudged through mud where motor vehicles failed. But in some regiments, these humble animals became something more than pack carriers. They became performers, trained to lift spirits by doing tricks, and even to dance. Accounts from soldiers' diaries tell of donkeys coaxed into standing on their hind legs, encouraged with scraps of food and laughter. Some were taught to sway in time to gramophones that soldiers cranked in muddy dugouts. Others learned to shuffle sideways, almost like waltzing partners, as men clapped and cheered. Imagine the scene: a line of exhausted soldiers, uniforms caked in mud, faces gaunt with fatigue, suddenly bursting into laughter as a donkey reared up and pawed the air to the scratchy tune of a military band record. For a moment, the war fell away. The donkey was the star, and the men were the audience, clapping along, as though they sat in a theater instead of a trench. One famous story came from Gallipoli, where an Australian stretcher bearer named John Simpson used a donkey to carry wounded men down from the front lines. Though Simpson's donkey wasn't a dancer in the comic sense, soldiers remembered the sight of the animal calmly stepping through chaos as strangely uplifting. It showed the endurance of both man and beast, stubbornly pressing forward together. Elsewhere on the Western Front, performing donkeys became mascots for units. They were dressed in improvised costumes, draped with flags, and paraded about during lulls in fighting. Soldiers even staged mock shows, with donkeys pulling exaggerated bows, or nudged into dances that looked more like clumsy hops. But the men laughed anyway, and in a war where laughter was rare, that was worth everything. These animals became symbols of resilience. Donkeys are famously stubborn, but also patient and enduring, qualities soldiers admired. When a front felt endless, when rations were thin and morale thinner, watching a donkey prance clumsily on its hind legs felt like a reminder that life could still be ridiculous, still be joyful. In some accounts, soldiers even described the donkeys as heroes of humor. No medals were pinned to them, no statues built, but their role in keeping spirits alive was every bit as vital as food or water. Because war, after all, is not just fought with weapons, it's endured with whatever scraps of laughter can be found. When the war ended, few of the donkeys came home. Most were sold, given away, or left behind where they had served. But the memories of them, donkeys that danced, shuffled, or simply brayed loudly enough to drown out artillery for a moment, lived on in letters, songs, and anecdotes told by veterans. And so, tucked between the great tragedies of the First World War, there exists this gentler memory, that on muddy fields where millions suffered, donkeys once danced to gramophone songs, making weary men laugh until their sides ached. And if donkeys once danced in the mud of war, cows once caused panic in the green fields of England, because some believed they were being used as spies. The Cow Spy Panic, World War II, England. War makes people cautious. Every sound, every movement can stir suspicion. But in England during the Second World War, suspicion sometimes went a little too far. So far, in fact, that even cows became suspects. It began with the constant fear of German spies. Britain, facing nightly bombings and the threat of invasion, was on edge. The government issued posters warning citizens to report anything unusual. A stranger asking questions, a light showing at night, even a peculiar accent overheard in a pub. Careless talk costs lives, the posters read. The message was clear. Vigilance could save the nation. But when vigilance meets imagination, strange things happen. And soon, rumors began to spread that enemy spies might be using cows as disguises, or worse, hiding radio equipment inside them. Farmers in rural counties wrote letters to local authorities, claiming they had spotted cows behaving suspiciously. One report told of a cow that seemed to stare too long at a nearby military base. Another claimed a herd had gathered in an unusual formation, as though signaling to passing aircraft. Jokes spread quickly in newspapers. Keep an eye out for cows chewing in Morse code, or udders that doubled as antennae. Behind the humor, though, was genuine unease. The countryside was critical to the war effort. Fields grew food, barns hid supplies, and farm roads carried soldiers and convoys. If spies could blend in anywhere, rural England seemed a likely place. And what better disguise than a herd of grazing cattle, calm and unassuming. Of course, the logistics of fitting a grown man into a cow costume or installing a working radio inside one were absurd, but wartime fear often bends reason. Officials investigated more than one such claim, trudging into fields to examine bewildered livestock. The cows, naturally, offered no explanation. They simply swished their tails and went back to chewing grass. The British press, never one to miss an opportunity for satire, ran with the story. Cartoons depicted German spies peering out from cow suits, binoculars poking through horns. Headlines teased, "Is Bessie a Boche?" and "Move Emmett at midnight." The humor helped relieve the tension, turning paranoia into laughter. In truth, animals did play roles in espionage during the war, though not cows. Pigeons were used to carry messages. Dogs carried supplies. Even cats, some claimed, were employed as stealthy companions. But cows? They remained innocent, accused only by rumor and imagination. Looking back, the cow spy panic seems ridiculous, yet it captures something essential about life in wartime, how fear can creep into the ordinary. A herd of cattle, normally symbols of calm and routine, became the focus of suspicion simply because people were anxious, watchful, and desperate to explain every shadow. And perhaps, in its silliness, the story was useful. It gave people something to laugh about, even as bombs fell and radios crackled with grim news. Better to joke about cows chewing Morse code than to dwell endlessly on danger. Today, the cow spy panic survives in old newspaper clippings and fond retellings. No spies were ever found grazing in English fields. The cows, it turned out, were just cows, but for a brief time, they were part of the theater of war, drafted into the role of unlikely suspects in a nation's great drama of vigilance. And if cows once stirred paranoia with their silent stares, fruit once stirred excitement, because in 19th century Connecticut, people raced melons downhill for sport. The Great Melon Rolling Contest, 1850s Connecticut. Not all strange history involves emperors or wars. Sometimes it begins with something as simple and slippery as a melon. In the mid-19th century, the city of New Haven, Connecticut, developed a curious pastime that quickly grew into a local tradition, the melon rolling contest. The idea was simple. Find a steep hill, line up a row of ripe watermelons, and let gravity do the rest. At first, it began informally. Young people rolled melons for fun, laughing as the fruit bounced and tumbled down the cobblestones. Spectators gathered to watch the chaos, melons splitting open in juicy explosions, others miraculously rolling straight and true all the way to the bottom. Soon, the pastime grew competitive. By the 1850s, the contests had become semi-organized events. Participants chose their finest melons, boasting about their size, shape, and smoothness of rind. Crowds lined the streets to cheer and place wagers. Would the round, compact melon roll farther? Would the long, oblong one wobble and crash early? It was fruit as sport, and New Haven residents took it surprisingly seriously. The course of choice was often College Street, a steep downhill stretch near Yale University. Onlookers, including curious students, watched as rows of melons were set free. They bounced, wobbled, collided, and sometimes even careened into storefronts, much to the annoyance of shopkeepers. Children squealed with delight, racing after the runaway fruit. Betting men shouted encouragement at their champions. The contest was not without its risks. More than one pedestrian found themselves dodging a rogue melon, barreling downhill at surprising speed. And while most crashes ended with little more than a burst of juice and laughter, the potential for mischief was enormous. Newspaper accounts from the time describe it as equal parts comedy and nuisance. Local police, of course, were less amused. What began as light-hearted chaos eventually became a public hazard. Broken fruit littered the streets, attracting insects and creating a sticky mess for horses and carriages. One exasperated editorial declared that New Haven was rolling headlong into absurdity. By the late 19th century, authorities cracked down, banning the practice altogether. The melon races faded into memory, replaced by safer amusements, but the legend remained. Looking back now, it is easy to see the charm. Before baseball diamonds and football fields became standard, communities often invented their own amusements, however peculiar. In New Haven, for a brief and glorious time, the humble watermelon was both athlete and spectacle. It is a reminder that history is not only made by kings and battles, but by people finding joy in the simplest of things, like fruit rolling downhill on a summer afternoon. The melons are gone, but the laughter they caused still echoes faintly in the old newspaper clippings and nostalgic retellings. And if melons once rolled their way into glory, potatoes once found themselves in even stranger circumstances, placed on trial in court, accused of crimes against humanity. The potato was put on trial, 18th century, Ireland and France. It is hard to imagine today, but there was a time when people in Europe did not trust potatoes. In fact, in the 18th century, the humble tuber was so suspicious in some places that it were mocked, rejected, and even put on trial as though it were a criminal. Potatoes had arrived from the Americas in the 16th century, carried across the ocean by explorers. They grew easily, resisted drought, and produced more food per acre than grain. To modern eyes, they look like the perfect crop. But to many Europeans, they seemed strange and unsettling. For one thing, potatoes grew underground. Bread and grain came from golden fields waving in the sun. Potatoes hid in the dirt, their lumpy shapes unfamiliar. Some whispered they were unnatural, perhaps even the work of dark forces. Others claimed they caused diseases like leprosy or tuberculosis. Priests in some regions frowned upon them because they were not mentioned in the Bible. In Ireland, where famine loomed over poor farmers, potatoes were gradually accepted for their reliability. But in France, suspicion ran deep. One man, the agronomist Antoine Augustin Parmentier, took it upon himself to change that. A veteran of the 7 Years' War, Parmentier had been imprisoned in Prussia, where he was fed almost nothing but potatoes. He discovered they were not only edible, but nourishing. When he returned to France, he began a campaign to rehabilitate the potato's reputation. But his efforts faced ridicule. At times, local courts staged mock trials, treating the potato as if it were a defendant. Witnesses accused it of causing illness. Spectators laughed as lawyers pretended to cross-examine the vegetable. It was theater, of course, but it revealed the depth of resistance to this new food. Parmentier, undeterred, turned to clever tricks. He held public banquets featuring potato dishes, inviting celebrities and royalty. He even sent bouquets of potato flowers to King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, who wore them in their hair. And perhaps most famously, he planted fields of potatoes near Paris, but surrounded them with guards. The guards' presence made the crop seem valuable. At night, he quietly told them to look the other way, allowing curious peasants to steal potatoes, believing they were getting something precious. Soon, the potato became fashionable, and then indispensable. By the end of the 18th century, potatoes had gone from accused criminal to staple food across Europe. They fed armies, filled kitchens, and eventually became so central that entire cultures were built on them. The Irish in particular came to rely heavily on the crop, a reliance that would prove tragic during the Great Famine of the 19th century. But in Parmentier's time, the story had a happier ending. His campaign worked. The potato was acquitted in the court of public opinion, embraced not as poison, but as nourishment. Today, the idea of a potato on trial feels like satire. but it is a reminder of how strange and slow the path to acceptance can be. Sometimes, the foods we take for granted arrive not with open arms, but with suspicion, laughter, and even mock trials. And while potatoes once stood accused in court, across the ocean in modern America, a town once decided that if people could make silly choices, they might as well elect a dog as mayor. The dog mayor of Cormorant, Minnesota, 2014 to 2019. Politics is rarely described as cute, but in the tiny town of Cormorant, Minnesota, the mayor was not a career politician, not a lawyer, not even a person. He was a dog. A large, shaggy Great Pyrenees named Duke. The story began in 2014 when Cormorant held its annual festival and local elections. The town was small, just a few hundred people, and the atmosphere was friendly. Someone jokingly suggested putting Duke's name on the ballot. The idea caught on, and when the votes were counted, Duke had won by a landslide. With a wag of his tail, he became the official mayor. Duke, fluffy and dignified in his white coat, soon embraced the role. He appeared at public events wearing a tie around his neck or a tiny mayoral sash. He rode in parades perched proudly in a truck, ears flapping in the wind while townsfolk cheered. Children rushed forward to pet him, and visitors laughed at the sight of a dog leading a community. Unlike most politicians, Duke caused no scandals, no arguments, no controversies. His policies were simple: more belly rubs, more treats, and above all, more good cheer. Residents joked that under his leadership, potholes seemed less serious and smiles more common. His presence reminded people that sometimes government could be lighthearted, even joyful. Duke's fame spread beyond Minnesota. Newspapers and television stations picked up the story. Reporters marveled at the sight of a dog who had been elected repeatedly by his adoring citizens. Tourists came to visit the canine mayor, snapping pictures and buying souvenirs. Duke became a small-town celebrity, a furry ambassador of good humor. He went on to serve not just one term, but 4. Each re-election was greeted with laughter and affection, as if Cormorant itself had embraced the joke and turned it into tradition. Duke, meanwhile, seemed content to bask in the love, lounging at public gatherings or gently greeting visitors with a paw. Sadly, in 2019, Duke passed away. The town mourned him deeply, remembering him not just as a mascot, but as a symbol of community spirit. For 5 years, their mayor had been a dog, and somehow it had made life feel a little brighter. Duke's story is whimsical, but it also speaks to something larger. In a world where politics often divides, here was a leader who united everyone through nothing more than friendliness and fur. He asked for nothing, gave only warmth, and left behind laughter. Perhaps that is leadership in its purest form. Today, when people tell the story of Duke, the dog mayor of Cormorant, they smile. It is one more reminder that history is not only shaped by wars, kings, or inventions, but also by small towns, ordinary people, and one extraordinary dog who wore a tie and made the world just a little gentler. Closing reflection. And so, from emus and dancing plagues to exploding whales and potato trials, from straw hat riots to canine mayors, we have wandered through 25 of history's strangest true events. Each is funny, curious, sometimes tragic, but always human, or at least occasionally animal. They remind us that the past was never neat or predictable. It was full of surprises, accidents, and oddities that make us laugh centuries later. And perhaps that's the best way to drift into sleep, with the comforting thought that history isn't only grand battles and solemn dates. It's also rabbits chasing emperors, donkeys dancing in trenches, and a dog named Duke wearing a tie as mayor of a town. So close your eyes. Let these odd little stories swirl together like dreams. Because if history itself can be this strange, then perhaps our dreams can be just as wonderfully weird.